Excuse me, folks. Pass through here. Excuse me again. And so, folks, as you make your way in, there's plenty of space to the left and right. So, welcome to the room where the United States becomes the United States. Imagine you're in the late spring of 1776. You're one of the 60 or so representatives from the 13 colonies. You're in this room. You've been meeting here for almost the past year, debating and arguing, proposing and counter-proposing, and considering what's going on outside of this room as well. It's not just a group of 60 men who declare independence. It's also a lot of influence from the public. The American colonists began to consider the words of an Englishman, Thomas Paine, who argues in his manifesto, Common Sense, that they have every right and capability of self-governance. They've demonstrated this throughout almost a century of colonial governance. They can take it to the next step. They also have the opportunity to divorce themselves from the old systems of monarchy, of aristocracy. And being in the new world, there's no reason for them to be tethered to the old world. Now that builds popular support. Politically, we realize that there's no practical hope for compromise. Upon hearing of the battles of Lexington and Concord, and later Bunker Hill, King George III declares that not just Massachusetts, but all 13 colonies are considered to be in a state of active rebellion. Anyone supporting that rebellion, politically, militarily, financially, can be condemned as a traitor, enemy of the state, subject to arrest, conviction, and execution. King George III offers some form of clemency, though. If they abandon this rebellion and accept the rule of his government, they will be spared. He's offering the colonists surrender or die. Colonists begin to consider another choice, separation. There are some, like John Adams, who've been advocating for this for quite a while. First, reinforcing and defending our rights through powder, through muskets, through cannon. Later, extended towards separation, independence. Benjamin Franklin, pragmatist from Pennsylvania, recognizes that compromise is not feasible, though he does also recognize that it's going to take a bit of diplomacy and tact to convince many of the more elected members on this course. Thomas Jefferson, here from Virginia, says very little during the convention, but he is looking at this as an opportunity to expand upon the rights that he has helped to develop and legislate in Virginia. He's going to have a major role coming up shortly after a proposal is brought forth by his colleague from Virginia. Richard Henry Lee will propose in June of 1776 that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free, and independent states. This decision will require a unanimous vote of all 13 delegations. The individual delegates within these delegations have to agree on what their colony's one vote will be. It's very hard to get that unanimity. It's anticipated that the resolution will be carried sometime in the future, perhaps in July. Anticipating this, Thomas Jefferson is tasked with drafting a statement to be released, justifying the actions of this Congress, what will become the Declaration of Independence. He's directly assisted by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Over much of the month of June, Adams and Franklin will assist Jefferson as he drafts, redrafts, and rewrites his declaration until June 28th, when they're satisfied that it's ready to present to the Congress. We'll have to wait a few days. The vote is carried in this room on July 2nd, 1776. 13 American colonies are now the 13 United States. Their statement that they're going to present, though, still requires a bit more tweaking. This is a room full of lawyers and politicians, some philosophers. They have different motivations and opinions, and they begin to examine and tear into Jefferson's declaration, making 80 changes over the course of 2 days. Some are stylistic, some have long-lasting ramifications. Jefferson initially condemns King George III as a supporter of the Atlantic slave trade and seeks to call him out in this declaration. That is deleted. Jefferson is considered to be a hypocrite by some of these men, given the fact that he owns many slaves. And for the more practical point, we're here to discuss political separation, not the issue of this institution. On July 4th of 1776, an edited declaration is finally approved by the Constitution or by the Congress and ordered to be printed. You're going to have 200 of these broadsides printed here in Philadelphia over the next day, and then distributed far and wide throughout the new United States for public readings, for postings, for reprinting to newspaper. A few are intercepted by the British and make their way over to London. There are 2 there in the National Archives. Here in this very block, just outside where you lined up for your tour, July 8, 1776, a crowd of about 2,000 people gather to hear the Pennsylvania militia publicly read the Declaration of Independence for the first time. This will be the first time in many cases that the average inhabitant here in Pennsylvania gets to hear the famous words and the arguments that Jefferson puts forth. You might have heard this saying before, this prose. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What exactly does this mean? 2 key principles: popular sovereignty and natural rights. You're born in a free and equal station. Your rights are subject to that birth, not to the whims or the opinions of whoever's in charge presently. They cannot be issued by a government. They cannot be restricted by a government. Government's legitimacy stems from the approval, the consent of a free citizenry. And that consent can be withdrawn. Government can be reshaped and reformed as deemed appropriate by a free citizenry. It's a very different model than you'd expect from the 18th century. This is an era of kings, of queens, absolute monarchs, of inherited power, aristocracy, dynasties, and yet here we're calling for a new style of government, one that's a direct product of the philosophical movement of the Enlightenment. Now, it's a very lofty ambition. It is one that is going to be difficult to realize, is just because the 13 American colonies now call themselves the United States and consider themselves independent, doesn't mean that the British Empire is going to let them walk away without a fight. A fight that will continue for 7 more years, and by the end of this conflict in 1783, you'll see the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, anyone with a rivalry of Great Britain taking part. There'll be some battles on the far corner of the globe that don't involve a single American. Overall, the American Revolution is going to touch off a fundamental chain in the last quarter of the 18th century. Great Britain decides it's not worth the trouble or the risk of losing its more valuable possessions to try to maintain its hold on the colonies. It signs the Treaty of Paris in 1783, recognizing American independence. Then the real work begins for the states. They never entered the revolution, their bid for independence, with the idea that they'd emerge as one nation. In fact, they're very much opposed to it. They're separate political units, they want to maintain them. They'll cooperate in areas of common interest, but they will not be beholden to another central authority. Because of this, they shape themselves into a confederacy. Under the Articles of Confederation, a firm league of friendship, the states work together on a strictly voluntary basis. If there are matters which they choose to address as a common body, these must be decided unanimously. It's a very cumbersome, awkward, inefficient model. There are many practical concerns. The states are bankrupt. They fought the war on credit. They owe millions of dollars to their European allies, to their own soldiers who had fought the war for independence, and they have virtually no tax revenue. There's no way to raise taxes, as again, states are not going to voluntarily pay more than they have to. They can't establish line of credit, and just mentioning the word taxes is seen as a political third rail. You're going to have rebellions. Veterans of the Revolution who have not been paid begin to march on the local Capitol buildings, demanding their back wages, shutting down bankruptcy courts. You're going to have squabbles between the states. Where does the boundary line lay between, say, New York and Massachusetts? Who owns Vermont? Independent militias of settlers begin attacking each other on the frontier. There are Native American rebellions and threats of foreign invasion. And this will continue over the course of 4 years. The United States almost tears itself apart due to how dysfunctional its governments are. By 1787, this Congress of Confederation is so maligned and so ineffectual that few, if any, members bother to show up for day-to-day business. A convention is organized after a series of false starts to try to improve this model right here in Philadelphia in this very room. In June of 1787, a summer convention begins, attended by delegates such as from Virginia, James Madison and George Washington, from New York, Alexander Hamilton, and from Pennsylvania, again, Dr. Benjamin Franklin. They quickly realized there's no practical way to salvage these Articles of Confederation. For one state refuses to send any delegates, Rhode Island, and without a unanimous vote, nothing can be changed. They're faced with a choice. They can either pack up and leave, or they can throw away the old model and draft a new one. And that's what they choose to do. Over the summer, between June and September of 1787, in this room, a framework for the largest geographic republic envisioned since the days of ancient Rome begins to take shape. How exactly this republic will be governed? Well, that's subject to many arguments, proposals, counter-proposals, even a few threats to walk out the door. Something as petty as what to call the executive, president, or something more noble is an argument. How many presidents should be? Should be a council chosen by the state governors? Should it be elected? Can we trust the common citizen with that much power to vote? How will the states be represented in this new nation? Do larger states like Virginia deserve more power, more votes, more representation? Well, if so, small states like Delaware and New Jersey probably aren't going to go along with this model. They demand equal representation. Through a series of compromises, we're going to get a proposal, and a second proposal, and a third proposal that eventually forms the articles of this Constitution. The president will be an executive, a single person elected through an intermediary for a 4-year term. The legislative branch will be split between the two ideas of equal and proportional representation of elected and appointed positions. A separate independent judiciary will be envisioned, the Supreme Court, chosen by the president, confirmed by the Senate. What exactly they do on a day-to-day basis, we're not sure, but we'll figure that out afterwards. Do we need a Bill of Rights? Alexander Hamilton says no, it's superfluous, unnecessary. James Madison says yes, it's essential. The issue is tabled until after this Constitution is ratified. The issue of slavery comes up time and time again. You won't see the word slave or slavery mentioned once in the Constitution, but it's tacitly endorsed and protected for at least a 20-year period after ratification. You're going to see a process to incorporate adaptations addressing these issues that are still lingering, anticipating new issues that we can't foresee here in 1787. 4 years after the Constitution is signed in this room, in 1791, you'll see the Bill of Rights ratified. 80 years after ratification, you'll see slavery eradicated from the United States at the cost of a 4-year civil war and 500,000 American lives. 60 years after that, you'll see that half the population has the right to vote protected through a constitutional amendment, with the 19th Amendment being ratified in 1920. Brings us to today. In 2022, there are 27 constitutional amendments, 27 fundamental changes, additions, in some cases deletions to this Constitution as we adjust it as our society evolves and as our idea of what an American Republic should be changes. If you go back to the day that this Constitution is signed in this room, September the 17th, 1787, you'll see that many people here are skeptical. Some felt this Constitution would only be good for a generation or two, and then there'd be another convention. Some feel it goes too far, others that it did not go far enough. Of the 50 or so men who attended the Constitutional Convention, 39 would choose to endorse or sign it, including Dr. Benjamin Franklin. He'll admit this Constitution is limited and somewhat flawed, but is the best that could reasonably obtain given the circumstances in a very short time frame. Cautiously optimistic, he draws some inspiration from a curious symbol that he's seen in the one original piece of furniture. The chair behind me, occupied by George Washington during this convention as president of the convention. At the top of the chair is a half-sun, gilt in gold, with 13 rays of light and crowned by a liberty head. Dr. Franklin wondered, did this relief represent these new United States struggling to emerge? When the convention takes a downward turn, he worries that this is perhaps a setting sun. September 17, 1787, upon signing this Constitution, Dr. Franklin comments that he has the happiness to know that it is indeed a rising sun and not a setting sun. Dr. Franklin will also recognize this style of government is a fragile thing, very difficult to maintain. As he's leaving the building, he addresses a curious public, famously states that the Americans now have a republic if they can keep it. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for visiting this morning. It's been a pleasure showing you the museum. Feel free to take a few more pictures, but the next tour is going to come in, so take them quickly. We'll be exiting outside to the left. I'll be in the stair tower if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
rights of the states regarding legal proceedings and lawsuits. So out of the 27 amendments in the United States Constitution, 11 are ratified in the first 10 years, right here in Philadelphia. The country will expand. The Northwestern territories, which is now Michigan, parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, are going to be incorporated. Closer to the original 13 states, you'll have 3 new states, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. As they come into the Union, they have full rights of representation, of citizenship, and they will also expand the rights of the previous generations. No longer in these states will it be a requirement to own a significant amount of property to exercise your right to vote. That was the old British model that was carried over in the New Republic, and it's slowly being replaced. So this is the United States Senate chamber as it would have appeared between 1795 and 1800. This section of the building we're in, from the wall to the bay window, was a 1794 addition that was put in. As the Congress was growing in size, the building was lengthened to accommodate the growing body. We have represented here the Senate at its maximum here in Philadelphia with 32 members of the 16 states. So 2 senators per state has been the model since the Constitution was ratified in 1789. The Senate has evolved a bit over the past 2¼ centuries. For one, the public are allowed to begin to watch some of the debates and votes beginning in 1795. Public galleries put in. And in 1913, Americans begin to directly elect their senators through elections rather than having them appointed by the state legislatures. There's a change in philosophy as to what the Senate should be, another voice of the people rather than strictly a voice of the states. Now, the senators here at this time are going to be chosen by the state legislatures. They see themselves as ambassadors to the federal government from their states, and they see themselves as above the House of Representatives, the more senior, the more elite of the body. They're entrusted with a great deal of oversight over the executive. Presidential cabinet nominations, federal judiciary positions, including the Supreme Court nominations, all have to go through the Senate for approval. Which is going to be the question, though. Does the Senate is the Senate required to provide its consent if the president chooses to dismiss a cabinet member? And that is actually ruled as an overreach, so no. The president shouldn't be that beholden to the whims of the legislature. Furthermore, the executive will have some influence over the legislative branch here in the Senate, as the vice president of the United States is the president of the Senate. There's not much for him to do on a day-to-day basis, as John Adams complains in his letter to his wife. But some of his responsibilities can be decisive. If there's a split Senate, a tie vote, the vice president gets to cast a tie-breaking vote. John Adams will do this time and time again, as he would have believed George Washington would intend him to vote in agreement with his policies.